Welcome to a special GrainTALK question and answer session on the Clean Fuel Standard. I'm Rachel Telford, and I will be facilitating the discussion today. The federal government is developing a clean fuel standard to reduce Canada's greenhouse gas emissions through the increased use of lower carbon fuels, energy sources, and technologies. The objective of the Clean Fuel Standard is to achieve up to 30 million tons of annual reductions in GHG emissions by 2030. The federal government has proposed criteria around the crops grown to create biofuels, including corn and soybeans. These conditions will hinder the ability of grain farmers to grow these crops here in Ontario if we want to sell into the renewable fuel market. As we all know, ethanol and biodiesel reduce GHG emissions. Grain farmers are willing to do their part to meet Canada's climate change goals, and we are proud of the work that has already been done to reduce the environmental impact of farming. Here with me to discuss the federal government's clean fuel mandate and the concerns raised by grain farmers of Ontario is Markus Haerle, Chair of the Board of Directors, and Crosby Devitt, CEO of Grain Farmers of Ontario. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
My first question is for you, Crosby. What part of this proposed mandate does Grain Farmers of Ontario have concerns over?
Well, first, the clean fuel standard concept of having a better fuel supply with lower carbon intensity would be supported by the grain farmers of Ontario and farmers across Ontario. However, in the proposed regulation that we've seen so far, there's a number of areas of concern, and one of the main ones is around what they're calling LUB criteria, land use and biodiversity. And what they're proposing at this point is to put some fairly severe restrictions on the ability for farmers to improve their land or to continue growing crops where they traditionally would have if it was in a zone that they deemed too close to a waterway. And those are areas where farmers have been farming that land for decades sustainably. And what the concern is that these new proposed regulations are imposing restrictions that aren't based on science or protection of the environment and are just going to cause hardship for farmers. So that's the one area. The other part is one of the goals is to reduce the carbon intensity of fuels, of course. And so to do that, the proposal is to measure the carbon footprint or of any feedstocks, which would include, say, corn for ethanol, for example. And so in that, there's different ways to calculate it, and there hasn't really been any consultation on the components of that model that they'll be using. And with that, what we'd like to see is the opportunity to be able to see where those opportunities for improvement down the road are, but also what kind of recognition for improvements that have been made to get us to 2020, how they fit into that model.
So Markus, what will that mean for grain farmers?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Rachel. So for grain farmers, that can be very impactful as it is, as this regulation has been proposed. First of all, it has a couple of items in there that are alarming of how and who will be supplying the feedstock for the renewable fuel industry. As Ontario has always been a great advocate and very responsive to the clean fuel standard in the past, now with the regulation change, that can actually mean that farmers that have done some improvements on farms or that have maybe landscape in their farming that they do that doesn't meet criteria, they will not be able to sell grain to the biofuel industry anymore. And that becomes concerning because all of a sudden we're going to open up the doors to imports, to foreign grain that might be flooding the market. And our feed market is certainly not going to open up more to where we can divert our corn or soybean crop towards. So, and we also have to be conscious that some of the dry distillers grains that come out of the biofuel industry usually end up in the feed market, which actually creates a complete loop. And again, it creates a higher protein product for the feed market, and we're very happy to supply that through the industry. But now moving forward, farmers are really concerned of how this is actually being streamlined and put in front of one sector specifically that's going to be targeted.
Grain Farmers of Ontario has submitted an official response to the proposed mandate, and we've also spoken out publicly about our concerns. Crosby, what is Grain Farmers of Ontario asking the government for?
So we're looking for a clean fuel standard that recognizes the value that corn ethanol and other crop-based biofuels contribute to climate improvement as well as to emissions reduction. And so we know from work that's been done, corn ethanol especially, very established industry, especially in Eastern Canada, makes positive contributions. And we're looking for that recognition of that in the standard, as well as the ability for farmers and the ethanol industry and the fuel industry in Canada to be able to rely on that. And so to be able to do that, we're looking for changes to what they call the land use and biodiversity criteria. We don't really see a need for that in this standard. It's not related to carbon emissions. And we're also looking for meaningful consultation on the carbon intensity and the life cycle assessment. We understand there's a movement to a new system. It's very uncertain what that is, and we want to see farmers consulted and to ensure that the real world production system and how corn is grown is recognized, and there's clear pathways should the standard provide opportunities for farmers to improve even further.
Did the government consult with agronomists and experts in farm sustainability before drafting these restrictions?
So the drafts were done without consultation from Grain Farmers of Ontario. Back in the summer of 2020, there was a discussion document with the proposal put out for public comment. And so GFO did evaluate that in a lot of detail and submitted a very detailed response to that, including some of the things that we're looking to see change and suggestions for improvement on how to actually meet the goals of the clean fuel standard in a way that doesn't hinder the ability for farmers to be strong participants.
So how did they decide that these were sustainable practices?
Well, that's a very good question. As you can tell, farmers weren't really consulted during the discussion about how to come up with those numbers. To our knowledge and to the work that we've done, they are not really based on scientific study or practical real world environmental considerations. And so that's part of the challenge we have with it is, as an organization and as farmers, we're subject to many regulations that are science-based and logical and quite happy to follow that. But these just don't appear to be based on anything that would be considered sound science.
Markus, do on-farm practices that you currently use and that other farmers are using outweigh the benefits of the proposed criteria?
Well, we certainly do already have significant practices that are actually outweighing the criteria that they are proposing. Farmers have adopted significant changes to the growing the crop in the last 20, 30 years. So for a couple of examples, farmers are using more no-till, minimum till, strip till, cover crops that reduce the impact to the environment, first of all. And we're using less carbon and fossil fuels to farm an acre of land than we have been in the past. And we're actually getting more crop off an acre of land than back in 20, 30 years ago. So the carbon impact is already less. So why should we bear all the hurt and the concern from the clean fuel standard that they want to address?
And Crosby, from your perspective as a farmer, what current practices are more beneficial to meeting the government's goals?
So in terms of where farmers have come from, maybe I could just answer it by giving kind of a bit of a history. There's been a recent study done that's looked at trends in crop production and climate impact over the last 30 years. Farmers are becoming much more efficient at growing corn on a static or on a stable land base, so they're able to get more out of it with less impact on the land. Overall, a 45% improvement in climate impact. So that brings in things like efficiency of fertilizer use, efficiency of land, sustainability of soils, and things like that. So there's been a track record of improvement. And all indicators are that as we get new technology in place, we get better seed technology, we learn how to use products and fertilizer better, use things like cover crops that are now become mainstream. Those numbers are going to get better and better over time. And so we're on the right track. We want to work with government to enable those things to happen and not be burdened by extra regulation and extra paperwork and certification that really isn't trying to get us to that goal that we all share.
And Markus, will farmers' livelihoods be impacted if they can't grow corn for biofuels?
Well, of course they will be. So this is going to hit the bottom line at every farmer that's going to be selling grain from here on in. If once that regulation would come into place, Ontario has already a significant industry of biofuel manufacturers, and so we just take, for example, my own farm. My closest ethanol plant is an hour and a half away from me. This has a positive basis impact on my pricing of the grain. It has created stability for the grain market. It's also furthered us of actually developing new techniques of farming, because now all of a sudden that revenue stream was more stable. So once that's been taken away, that's going to shift to a different place, different area. And what we also have to think about here is how can we as farmers not be impacted into the long term? Because I think short term, we always seem to try to find a solution or a bridge to bridge our gap. But in the long term, that's where we're going to be actually impacted more than the short term base. And if we get the grains from outside of Canada coming in, they are going to be the ones that are going to be dictating the price from there on in, because we're going to be losing on the bottom line just right off the bat.
What will this mean for our competitiveness with U.S. corn farmers?
Well, of course, it's going to be something very difficult, because as a farmer, I'm actually going to be forced to compete with an outside interest, and having that in front of me, it's going to be very, very difficult, because it's going to create some challenges as a producer, as we're not going to be able to sell our grain to the normal path as we had seen it the last 20 years. And it's not only the biofuel that's produced domestically, it's also the biofuels that are imported in that are going to have pressure on pricing, on access, on mandates. And so what we're hoping is that all grains and biofuels coming in from outside of Canada have to meet the same criteria than we as producers would have to meet. Because otherwise we create a two-tiered system that's not going to be fair to any producer in Canada.
Now, Crosby, does Grain Farmers of Ontario's opposition to this clean fuel mandate mean that we're opposed to clean fuels or environmental laws?
Absolutely not. Farmers are strong supporters of the environment, and you can see that in what they're doing, right? If you look at the land that's farmed right now to grow grain crops across the province, much of that land's been farmed for way over 100 years, and those farmers and their families have figured out how to farm that land sustainably to keep it productive and to keep it growing good crops. The other part is that farmers are strong supporters of science-based regulation. There are a lot of regulations that farmers must follow, whether it's seed regulations, fertilizer, crop protection, even our grain quality, and what we can ship as grain to certain markets is highly regulated. And then the land use and the environmental protection side, there's regulations, provincial, federal, that farmers must follow to protect their land. And if it's science-based and it's logical, farmers welcome it because they want to see a protected land base as well. What the challenge is adding more on top that isn't based on science, that just adds another layer, that isn't going to accomplish the goals of the clean fuel standard, is not acceptable to farmers. And so certainly there's no question farmers welcome environmental protection. They want to see that land that they're on being farmed 100 years from now and forever. So no question there. It's the approach and it's the specifics of this thing that are really, really causing the problem.
And Markus, would you agree with those sentiments?
I totally agree what Crosby said here. I can tell you that farmers are not opposed to the clean fuel standard as a principle. It has been well received by farmers, by society itself, as being a good way of, first of all, creating a green energy system within Canada that we all can find a space. But then when we see all of a sudden that the environmental laws override the good deeds that we have already done in the past as being stewards of the land that do not pollute the environment, we put down less fertilizers today than we have done in the past. We have environmental initiatives that are sometimes regional, that are provincial and national, that we have to comply to. We're actually great advocates for environmental initiatives, and we're adopting them as they are coming towards us. And often enough, they are cost shared with farmer, province, and federal dollars. So I think we're open to do that in timely manner, not having it done overnight, that we all have to pay the big sacrifice for it, because sometimes you cannot just flick a switch and you're back in business. It's not that simple. It sometimes takes years to put something in place, and let's not rush it. Be proactive, yes, but be also smart about it. And again, I want to stress that everything has to be science-based before decisions are made, and that it's not driven by public perception or by policies that are created that are not thinking about an industry that would be impacted by that change.
Crosby, why is ethanol and the ethanol market important to Ontario grain farmers?
There's a few reasons. I think ethanol has become a real mainstream market for corn grown in Ontario. Basically, we can take corn from the field, take it to a local ethanol plant, of which there's several in Ontario, right in farm country. So there's low transportation requirements to get it to market. It's transformed into ethanol as well as distillers grains, which is then taken back into our livestock industry. So it's a real kind of circle. So it helps the farmer. It helps the create local jobs. The product in terms of fuel goes into reducing emissions in our vehicles, and then the byproducts go back into the livestock industry to help that as well. And so it's a great economic driver that's also good for the environment.
Markus, do you have anything to add on that?
Well, it's simple. We have quite a few manufacturers, industries here in Ontario that brought that great stability of the grain market. Because when we look at the ethanol side only, 30% of Ontario's corn is actually going into that into that process. It also creates, first of all, jobs. It also creates feedstock for livestock, and it also is actually proven that it is reducing the carbon emissions, even though we have to harvest the crop and transform it into a biofuel. It actually is not submitting more carbon than the fossil fuel. So it's actually a good initiative to have that in place. Now, if we take it to the next level of why it is that much important, well, again, for myself and for a lot of farmers in Ontario, those companies that actually are in the biofuel industry are only a couple of hours away from their doorstep. Our market is based on domestic a transformation of a product into a value added. We want to be job creators. We also want to do our part in the clean fuel manufacturing and to meet the mandates of governments. So I think this is actually a positive for all Canada itself of making sure that domestic production stays within.
I want to thank you, Markus and Crosby, for the discussion today. For more information on the Clean Fuel Mandate, please go to our website, gfo.ca, and read what we have posted under the Government Relations tab. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel.